Now reporting, George Stephanopoulos.
Good morning. We're coming on the air right now because President Trump is about to speak to the nation about the crisis with Iran. That is the scene at the White House right now. The president will be responding to those Iranian missile strikes against 2 U.S. military bases in Iraq last night, retaliation for the U.S. drone strike against Iran's top commander, Qasem Soleimani. That was last week. That killed him last week. The Iranians have responded with those rockets you see right there. More than a dozen ballistic missiles fired at 2 U.S. military bases in northern and western Iraq last night. So far, no reports of U.S. casualties. You see the president's cabinet now coming to join him there. Vice President Mike Pence, the Defense Secretary Esper, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, along with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, surrounding the president at the middle of the podium right there. This will be his first response after the tweet last night where he said all is well in response to that Iranian military strike. The Iranians have said that this is all the retaliation they will have for now, the supreme leader. They also claim there were dozens of U.S. military casualties in the strike, but as we've said, the Pentagon has said no American casualties in their initial damage assessments. Last week, President Trump ordered that drone strike, saying that General Soleimani was planning an imminent attack against the United States. That is coming in for some question on Capitol Hill, as the intelligence has not been released. But so far, at least, we've seen the Iranian retaliation right now, missile strikes which have caused no American casualties. The big question right now, will the president choose to escalate his response or take this as an opportunity to calm the crisis down? The Iranians in their first messages said that is what they want. The president is responding now.
As long as I'm President of the United States, Iran will never be allowed to have a nuclear weapon. Good morning. I'm pleased to inform you the American people should be extremely grateful and happy. No Americans were harmed in last night's attack by the Iranian regime. We suffered no casualties. All of our soldiers are safe, and only minimal damage was sustained at our military bases. Our great American forces are prepared for anything. Iran appears to be standing down, which is a good thing for all parties concerned and a very good thing for the world. No American or Iraqi lives were lost because of the precautions taken, the dispersal of forces, and an early warning system that worked very well. I salute the incredible skill and courage of America's men and women in uniform. For far too long, all the way back to 1979 to be exact, nations have tolerated Iran's destructive and destabilizing behavior in the Middle East and beyond. Those days are over. Iran has been the leading sponsor of terrorism, and their pursuit of nuclear weapons threatens the civilized world. We will never let that happen. Last week, we took decisive action to stop a ruthless terrorist from threatening American lives. At my direction, the United States military eliminated the world's top terrorist, Qasem Soleimani. As the head of the Quds Force, Soleimani was personally responsible for some of the absolutely worst atrocities. He trained terrorist armies, including Hezbollah, launching terrorist strikes against civilian targets. He fueled bloody civil wars all across the region. He viciously wounded and murdered thousands of U.S. troops, including the planting of roadside bombs that maim and dismember their victims. Soleimani directed the recent attacks on U.S. personnel in Iraq that badly wounded 4 service members and killed 1 American, and he orchestrated the violent assault on the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. In recent days, he was planning new attacks on American targets, but we stopped him. Soleimani's hands were drenched in both American and Iranian blood. He should have been terminated long ago. By removing Soleimani, we have sent a powerful message to terrorists. If you value your own life, you will not threaten the lives of our people. As we continue to evaluate options in response to Iranian aggression, the United States will immediately impose additional punishing economic sanctions on the Iranian regime. These powerful sanctions will remain until Iran changes its behavior. In recent months alone, Iran has seized ships in international waters, fired an unprovoked strike on Saudi Arabia, and shot down 2 U.S. drones. Iran's hostilities substantially increased after the foolish Iran nuclear deal was signed in 2013, and they were given $150 billion, not to mention $1.8 billion in cash. Instead of saying thank you to the United States, they chanted death to America. In fact, they chanted death to America the day the agreement was signed. Then Iran went on a terror spree, funded by the money from the deal, and created hell in Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, Afghanistan, and Iraq. The missiles fired last night at us and our allies were paid for with the funds made available by the last administration. The regime also greatly tightened the reins on their own country, even recently killing 1,500 people at the many protests that are taking place all throughout Iran. The very defective JCPOA expires shortly anyway and gives Iran a clear and quick path to nuclear breakout. Iran must abandon its nuclear ambitions and end its support for terrorism. The time has come for the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Russia, and China to recognize this reality. They must now break away from the remnants of the Iran deal, or JCPOA. And we must all work together toward making a deal with Iran that makes the world a safer and more peaceful place. We must also make a deal that allows Iran to thrive and prosper and take advantage of its enormous untapped potential. Iran can be a great country. Peace and stability cannot prevail in the Middle East as long as Iran continues to foment violence, unrest, hatred, and war. The civilized world must send a clear and unified message to the Iranian regime. Your campaign of terror, murder, mayhem will not be tolerated any longer. It will not be allowed to go forward. Today, I am going to ask NATO to become much more involved in the Middle East process. Over the last 3 years, under my leadership, our economy is stronger than ever before, and America has achieved energy independence. These historic accomplishments change our strategic priorities. These are accomplishments that nobody thought were possible. And options in the Middle East became available. We are now the #1 producer of oil and natural gas anywhere in the world. We are independent, and we do not need Middle East oil. The American military has been completely rebuilt under my administration at a cost of $2.5 trillion. U.S. armed forces are stronger than ever before. Our missiles are big, powerful, accurate, lethal, and fast. Under construction are many hypersonic missiles. The fact that we have this great military and equipment, however, does not mean we have to use it. We do not want to use it. American strength, both military and economic, is the best deterrent. 3 months ago, after destroying 100% of ISIS and its territorial caliphate, we killed the savage leader of ISIS, al-Baghdadi, who was responsible for so much death, including the mass beheadings of Christians, Muslims, and all who stood in his way. He was a monster. Al-Baghdadi was trying again to rebuild the ISIS caliphate and failed. Tens of thousands of ISIS fighters have been killed or captured during my administration. ISIS is a natural enemy of Iran. The destruction of ISIS is good for Iran, and we should work together on this and other shared priorities. Finally, to the people and leaders of Iran, we want you to have a future, and a great future, one that you deserve, one of prosperity at home and harmony with the nations of the world. The United States is ready to embrace peace with all who seek it. I want to thank you, and God bless America. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
President Trump right there with his response to the Iranian counterattack against U.S. military bases last night, saying that Iran is standing down. Iran appears to be standing down. That is the message from President Trump after announcing that Americans should be grateful that no Americans were harmed in the attack. There were no casualties and minimal damage at the U.S. military bases, according to President Trump. The president also, though, had some strong words for Iran, saying Iran will never be allowed to have a nuclear weapon on his watch, also announcing that he will be imposing tough new sanctions on Iran, but not announcing any new military action that might escalate this crisis with Iran. I want to go to Ian Pannell, our senior foreign correspondent in Erbil, where one of the U.S. military bases was struck last night. The president confirming there no casualties, also saying that the early warning system that had been put in place seemed to work. As you've been reporting all morning long, the Iraqis were given a heads up by the Iranians.
Yeah, that's right. I think some people will say, when is an attack not an attack? Now, that's not to minimize what happened and the gravity of it, but the fact that there were no U.S. casualties, no coalition casualties, and no Iraqi casualties is pretty remarkable given the scale of the attack. And ABC is now reporting that there were a number of short and medium-range missiles that were fired from multiple locations in Iran at these two sites in Iraq. So it's remarkable that no one was injured. We also know that U.S. troops were down in the bunker when those missiles were fired. Now, the Iraqi Prime Minister's office confirming to ABC News that they were given a call just after midnight local time by the Iranians to tell them that there was some form of attack coming. They didn't say where, they didn't say what particular sites, and they didn't say when. Now, we've asked repeatedly of the Iraqis, and also we've asked the Americans whether or not they communicated with each other about this threat. One presumes that they did, but neither side is willing to say so because potentially it compromises them. I think this was pretty conciliatory. I think many people would be pleased with this. The question now, I think, for us on the ground is how did the Iraqi militias respond? Remember, it was their actions in the first place, Kataib Hezbollah in particular, who fired those rockets at the U.S. base. It killed the U.S. contractor, that started to lead to this escalation. And we're certainly hearing from the leader of one of those organizations that is prescribed by the United States as a terrorist organization this evening. They're saying that the Iranians have had their turn. Now it's time for the Iraqi militias to respond. That may harm this conciliatory message.
We will be watching that. Of course, we're also going to be watching Iran. Our chief global affairs anchor, Martha Raddatz, in Tehran right now. And Martha, it does seem to be some delicate choreography here. The president saying the Iranians appear to be standing down. The foreign minister earlier today said that the Iranians had concluded their attack. So they're also, we're seeing conciliatory moves on both sides wrapped up in some pretty harsh rhetoric.
Exactly, George. Iran really walked a fine line here. We saw all week the emotion in this country for the loss of Soleimani, millions taking to the streets and shouting for revenge. But the Iranian officials had to know that they would be ending up in a huge conflict if they made a very, very massive attack somewhere. So they walked that line very well. They appeased the people here in so many ways, taking out some sort of retaliatory attack, but no loss of life and no larger conflict. The Iranians, the foreign minister told me that if they do not attack again, if the United States does not take military action, Iran will not either. George.
Martha Raddatz, thanks. Cecilia Vega at the White House. Cecilia, the president declaring something of a victory here, also reinforcing that message that he had several days ago after the killing of General Soleimani. The United States does not want a war.
Yeah, his final words were the United States is ready to embrace peace. And, George, I've got to say, this really was the greatest test that we have seen President Trump have so far, faced so far since taking office. You know this, just a few days ago, hours, frankly, before that strike hit yesterday, he was using that strong rhetoric, talking about any retaliation by Iran would be met by a disproportionate response from the United States. We are really seeing him walk that back off the ledge here today. And as Ian said, a lot of that will be, I think, come as a sigh of relief for many people watching the tensions increase over the last few days here, despite the mixed messaging, despite the fact that the White House still has yet to give a consistent answer on what started all of this and the why now, on why we struck Soleimani in the first place. But we are seeing here today a de-escalation from this White House, a strong change in rhetoric. And, George, it's worth pointing out, of course, that this is a president who campaigned and is now facing re-election again on his promise to end wars in the Middle East.
Getting out of the Middle East, and the president calling on NATO to get into the Middle East in those remarks as well. Okay, Cecilia, thanks very much. As the president said, no American, no Iraqi casualties last night. But just hours after the Iranian missile attacks on the U.S. bases, a passenger plane taking off from Tehran's airport went down just moments after takeoff, killing more than 170 people on board. I want to bring in our aviation consultant, David Curley, correspondent David Curley, for more on this. David, initially, the Ukrainians were backing up with the Iranians. Were saying that this was a mechanical failure. Now, all anyone is saying is the investigation is continuing. We don't know if this was an accident caused by something internal to the aircraft or something external.
What we do know, it appears, George, is that there was some catastrophic failure. That can be three things. An engine could blow up and blow apart the fuselage. There could be a bomb on board, or the possibility that it was shot down. We don't have any indication of either of those. We kind of see that it disappeared from flight tracking, which suggests that catastrophic failure. Now, the Iranians have the black box. That will have the answers for us, but they said they're not going to provide it to the manufacturer, Boeing, or to American officials, and they have not said who's going to read it out. If it was a shoot down, there is the possibility that the intelligence community tracked radar that actually could see that missiles were actually fired at this aircraft. Way too early to tell. There are indications on the wreckage as well if it was shot down or a bomb blast. The question is, who will the Iranians let see the wreckage and the black box that could tell us what happened to this airliner?
And right now, no one is seeing it. David Curley, okay, thanks very much. We're going to return now to our regular programming. Our coverage will continue on this crisis on ABC News Live with Tom Yamas.
All right, George, thank you. We're going to continue our coverage here on ABC News Live from our headquarters in New York. I'm Tom Yamas. We start with the big question. What is the next play for Iran or the United States? We just heard the president speak moments ago. I want to bring in Mick Mulroy, the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East in the Trump administration. Iran's foreign minister saying they, quote, concluded their attacks and do not seek escalation. Will the Pentagon take them at their word? It sounds like the president says this is de-escalated, Mick.
Yes. So from the statements the president just made, it sounds like this is going to de-escalate, and there is no intent to respond to the actions of the Iranians last night.
Yeah.
All right, Mick, we thank you for that. I want to go to Ian Panel now. He's in Erbil, Iraq. He heard some of those explosions as they were happening. And Ian, I understand that you have some new reporting about the actual missiles the Iranians fired last night.
Yeah, that's right. What we understand from a U.S. official is that there were 15 missiles in total. These were short and medium-range missiles that were fired from multiple locations in Iran. Now, we know that they were targeted on 2 different sites. One went to the Ain Assad air base. This is in western Iraq, and 3 of them landed not far from here, within a couple of miles. We heard 3 explosions last night. This was around the Erbil International Airport. Now, miraculously, as we know, that there were no U.S. casualties, no coalition coalition casualties and no Iraqi casualties. What we also learned from the Iraqi Prime Minister's office is that they received a call from the Iranians shortly after midnight local time. This was about an hour and 3/4 before those missiles struck, warning them that there would be some kind of attack. Now, apparently they didn't say what would be struck. They didn't say exactly when those missiles would be fired, but that was a long period of time to allow everyone to have a heads up and to take cover. And we know that US troops were in a bunker at the time when those missiles landed. So as I say, 15 missiles. Of those 15, 4 apparently failed. Now, it's not clear whether they just landed in the wrong place or they exploded, but the official, certainly who's spoken to ABC, is not aware that any of them were intercepted. However, the Kurdish regional government here suggested to us that 2 of the 3 missiles who were fired into this area were intercepted. So we're still waiting for some more detail there. But I think a pretty conciliatory message from President Trump, which will go down exceedingly well for Iraq, which, of course, is caught between the middle of these two potentially warring sides. But just one other slightly worrying development to bring you up to date with: the Iraqi militias. Remember, this is where this conflict started to escalate. It was the actions of Kataib Hezbollah, one of those particular militias, firing rockets into a US base. It killed a US contractor, injured a number of others, that led to this steady escalation, eventually the killing of Qasem Soleimani. Now, what we're hearing from the leader of another of those Iraqi militias, one that is proscribed as a terrorist organization by the United States, they've made it very clear that Iran has had its response, and now it's the turn of the Iraqi militias. Now, I think that'd be deeply worrying, because the message we're now getting seems to suggest a conciliatory message, perhaps calming things down, de-escalation. If the Iraqi militias respond in a violent way, if there are deaths, then that will change the picture of what we're seeing tonight. But perhaps pressure from Tehran will rein them in. But that's the picture here. People will be relieved, I think, by the president's message.
You know, I'm curious. You've covered conflicts all over the world. You've covered wars before. Have you ever seen anything like this? Because you raised the question, was this essentially an attack if everyone had a heads up?
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, when is an attack not an attack? I mean, you get a heads up of an hour and 3/4. Now, that's not unprecedented. Remember that when the US responded in Syria and President Trump ordered for missiles to be fired into the bases there, we understand that the Russians had been given a heads up. So I guess on that level, it's not unprecedented. But this was touted as a huge response from the Iranians. There were blood-curdling threats. There was going to be revenge. There were going to be coffins. And there are many sites that the Iranians could have chosen, but they chose 2 sites where nobody was injured. Tom.
Ian, panel for us, Ian, we appreciate that new reporting. I want to bring our chief global affairs correspondent, Martha Raddatz. She has been in Tehran since Sunday. Martha, what's your sense of what the Iranian people want at this point? And I'm curious what message Iranian state TV has been putting out, as we know propaganda is such a major force in countries like Iran.
Well, I think right now the Iranian people are relieved. I think there was great fear that there would be a wider conflict when the missiles started flying out of here last night and were hitting Iraq. There were people around us who were genuinely afraid that President Trump would start launching missiles into the center of Tehran. One man said to me, "Oh my God, this means war. Are we at war?" They were so worried. They were asking us all the questions they possibly could. Iranian TV has been largely talking about the death of Soleimani. Everywhere you go in this city, from the moment we arrived and walked off that jetway, there were many documentaries about his life. In our hotel, there is a little shrine to Soleimani. Pictures absolutely everywhere. He is revered by many people here, so that's largely been on television. There were the first reports last night when the missiles were launched, but there was not a great deal of information. There was some information that clearly turned out to be wrong, that there were many casualties, but the foreign minister today somewhat corrected that, saying we just don't know about the casualties. I spoke to the foreign minister, Zarif, yesterday. This was just hours before those missiles were launched, and he made it clear that there would be some sort of retaliatory attack. He told me at the time that it wouldn't be targeting civilians, so it was clear it would probably be an attack on the U.S. military. And today he is the one who said we want to de-escalate. We want if the United States does not fire back, if the United States does not retaliate against the retaliation, then this phase of this is over. But the leaders here have also said, including the Supreme Leader, that they want U.S. forces out of the region. They want U.S. forces out of the Middle East. And one more thing, Tom. Hearing the president immediately talk about nuclear weapons here and that Iran would not be allowed to have nuclear weapons. Negotiating with the U.S. right now would be very difficult. I was here just 6 months ago, and they were saying they didn't trust the president then. But you never know with this administration what will work and what won't work. But the Iranians would have a very, very difficult time trusting any sort of deal since President Trump pulled out of the last one.
You know, Martha, what's your sense? Because you mentioned those documentaries run on Soleimani on the state-run TV. You mentioned the fact that Iran wanted revenge. Now that sort of the smoke is cleared and we know there's appears to be no casualties and minimal damage so far, will this be enough revenge for some of the Iranians, for the hardliners in that country?
I think it will, because I'm sure the hardliners had a say in what exactly was being pulled off. I'm sure the Supreme Leader had a say in exactly what kind of attack they would have, and the military obviously as well. But I think for now, this solves this most recent crisis and de-escalates it, and I think the hardliners would probably agree with that.
Martha Raddatz reporting from Tehran for us today. Martha, we appreciate that. Stay safe. Kira Phillips is at the Pentagon for us. And Kira, quite the imagery from the White House. Senior cabinet members surrounding him at the podium, along with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. What are you hearing from some of your sources there at the Pentagon and around the White House?
Well, I'll tell you what, it was quite a night. And Tom, after conducting 4 assignments overseas during Operation Iraqi Freedom for months at a time, I'm able to tell you firsthand that the Iranian influence was tremendous during that time, and it's continued during that time. So there was a lot of concern about the impact of Iran in that country as troops were moved out of Iraq, and if indeed the 5,000 troops remaining would be able to handle any type of attack. So the fact that we were able to confirm last night, and I had talked to my sources there on the ground, the ones that are the point people for casualty teams within the military, and they told me, Kira, no reports of deaths yet. The fact that that amount of troopers, in addition to no U.S. casualties when these attacks happened, really sends a huge message. Not only the fact that President Trump decided to take out General Soleimani, but the fact that when Iran retaliated, the U.S. Knew to go into the bunkers, knew that command and control needed to operate and attempt to divert those missiles, take out those missiles, and keep folks safe. So hearing the president come forward and getting tips last night that there were no casualties obviously was great news for the American people. And I think what stood out today, too, was the president did say that the early warning systems worked, and also that one line, Iran is standing down. And as Martha was reporting, what the Iranian foreign minister was telling her, and then also what we were seeing through tweets about the retaliation and the fact that Iran was not going to stand for the U.S. intervening with Iran, the fact that they are standing down at the moment is a big deal this morning and this afternoon.
Yeah, and a huge sigh of relief for all those American military families all across the country. Kira, we appreciate that. I want to go to Capitol Hill now and Mary Bruce. Mary, you know, so many Democrats had huge issues with the drone attack on Soleimani. They said they were taken by surprise. What's the news so far of the president's response and what Iran did launching those missiles against the U.S. bases in Iraq?
Well, Democratic lawmakers have been looking, or were hoping this morning, to hear from the president that he was going to de-escalate this situation. I suspect that they will be pleased with what they heard from the president. Many Republicans as well were hoping to hear that from the president, but that does not mean that the questions end up here. Democrats are incredibly frustrated that they were kept in the dark ahead of the airstrike last week that killed Soleimani, and they want more information. And in fact, in just a few hours, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, other top military officials officials will be right here on Capitol Hill briefing all members of the House and the Senate. And of course, we heard from the president today, not only was this a chance for him to respond to these latest attacks, but also a chance for him to explain the broader justification for the killing of Soleimani last week. And we heard the president say, of course, that the commander had American blood on his hands. And he also went on to say that he had been planning attacks on American targets. But the president said, we stopped him. And that is likely to be where lawmakers here are going to want to press these officials this afternoon. What was the justification for going in and killing Soleimani? Was it because there was an imminent threat, as the president and the administration has suggested, or was it because of retaliation for previous attacks in the past? There are a lot of questions here that lawmakers have, and Tom, they are hoping that they will finally get some clarity this afternoon.
Mary, while you're covering all these developments out of Iran and Iraq, I know you're also following the latest on impeachment. And while I have you, I'd like to get an update. What is the latest from the Senate, and what have we learned today? Because I know there have been some developments.
Yeah, well, the bottom line is that the impasse here does continue. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is still looking for more information about what a trial in the Senate will look like before she is willing to turn over the articles of impeachment. But it does seem that patience is running out here. We are hearing even from some top Democrats who say, look, it's time to get this trial started. Let's get things moving. It's time for the Speaker to hand over the articles of impeachment. Of course, just yesterday, we saw the Republican leader in the Senate, Mitch McConnell, say that despite Democrats' demands, he now has enough Republican votes to start a trial in the Senate without committing to additional witnesses. And that, of course, has been the big demand from Democrats. It's why Pelosi has been holding on to the articles, because she was trying to pressure Republicans to agree to new witnesses. It is clear, though, that Leader McConnell has been able to keep Republicans in line. So a lot of people up here wondering why is Speaker Pelosi waiting and continuing to hold on to these articles?
Mary Bruce reporting from Capitol Hill for us this morning. Mary, thank you for that. I want to go to Terry Moran now. Terry is our senior national correspondent out of D.C. He's covered several beats there in Washington. He's also covered the world for ABC News. Terry, I want to get your take on what's transpired over the last week, because so much has happened in the world over the last few days. We had the drone attack on Soleimani. We have now the response from Iran, but an interesting and measured response, if you will, from Iran. As Ian was saying there, it's hard to call it an attack when both the Iraqis and likely the Americans got a heads up. And now the president's saying it sounds like Iran is standing down, but it also sounds like the U.S. is standing down.
That's it exactly, Tom. What you're seeing is the culmination now of a different take by President Trump towards Iran and in the region. He came up into office, tore up the Iran nuclear deal that his predecessor Barack Obama had negotiated. It was very much disliked by allies like Israel and Saudi Arabia because Obama had focused laser-like on the Iranian nuclear program, seeing that as the major threat, and not on Iranian terrorism and malignant behavior throughout the region. That was the main concern of Saudi Arabia and Israel and others. And they felt that the deal strengthened Iran to go get to foment more problems in the region. And President Trump mentioned that today. I thought the most significant thing he said was, for far too long, all the way back to 1979, nations have tolerated Iran's fomenting terrorism, and he said those days are over. He imposed crushing sanctions on Iran, and what you've seen over the months since is Iran gradually stepping up its response, shooting down U.S. drones, seizing and disrupting shipping in the Persian Gulf, using proxies to attack American partners and ultimately Americans themselves in Iraq and elsewhere, and storming the embassy. President Trump's response: kill their national hero. That brought this long conflict, because of President Trump's changed strategy in the Middle East, to a head, and Iran backed down. They took this measured response, and now President Trump says we can have a deal, but this time it has to change behavior throughout the region, as well as nuclear deal. And, you know, he's doing this because Barack Obama succeeded. Despite what a lot of people say about the nuclear deal, at this point, it gives President Trump a stronger hand. Iran destroyed 98% of its enriched uranium. It destroyed more than 15,000 of its centrifuges to make that uranium. That's about 70% of its capacity. It poured concrete in its most dangerous reactor. It gave up its heavy water to make weapons. And so it is behind the eight ball. It would be eye-wateringly expensive for Iran, strangled under these new U.S. sanctions, to rebuild all that. They know that. This is a moment a crisis. But as the Chinese say, a crisis can also be an opportunity, and I think that's what you're hearing from President Trump.
Terry, do you believe this is the end of it? Because as you said, he was a national hero, Soleimani. The president today calling him the world's top terrorist. General Petraeus over the weekend saying the killing of Soleimani will have more impact than the killing of bin Laden or al-Baghdadi. Is this the end of it, or will we hear about more of a response maybe from militia factions or from other factions around the world?
I think you're absolutely right. This is not the end of revenge for the death of Qasem Soleimani. It's not the end from militias he was their patron. He developed them over 20 years. He was their father figure. He was their founder throughout the region, in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Lebanon. He was the leader of Iranian influence militarily and terroristically throughout the region. That will draw a reaction. His death will draw a reaction, and from the Iranian government. You know, in the past, one of the things Iran has done is strike back at Israel, at soft Israeli targets. They many years ago struck the Israeli community center in Buenos Aires. They look for Israeli targets that they can hit, and that is a very dangerous situation as well. But right now, the United States holds the cards, and President Trump is playing them. Now, Iran has demonstrated over the years fierce national pride and an ability to wage this asymmetric warfare very, very well. But as they look at the stakes here for them and their economy and their people who are sick of an immensely corrupt regime that is not serving their needs, it may be that we are going to see some kind of movement in the future, not in the near future, even while there is reprisal attacks by militias and perhaps by the Iranian government itself.
Terry Moran, we appreciate your perspective. I want to go to Chief Justice Correspondent Pierre Thomas on that point as we talk about revenge. He's in our Washington bureau. And Pierre, what are some of the threats we're looking at right now? And America, in large part, is on alert, even though it looks like war is not imminent at this point.
Tom, you're exactly right. I've been struck by the fact that Homeland Security in recent days has put out repeated notices, bulletins, and advisories warning that Iran, number one, has the capability to do physical attacks inside the United States, namely through potential Iranian agents, proxies like Hezbollah, who are stationed here, living here behind the scenes. They have made that clear that that's a real possibility. They've also talked openly and clearly about the notion of cyber attacks by Iran. And just last night, we had the governor of Texas state that he believes that he has evidence that attacks emanating from Iran. He did not assign specific blame for those attacks in terms of who's doing them, but he did say that they had information that attacks were coming from Iran, targeting his state agencies at a rate of 10,000 attempted attacks per minute, which is pretty incredible. So we're seeing implications here inside the United States. A number of major cities have taken steps to step up security. The NYPD put out a statement last night saying that they were surging security across the city as a precaution. Other cities are doing some of the same things, seen and unseen. So right now, everyone is waiting, hoping that this gets dialed back. But right now, the information is be prepared.
Yeah, and the cyber threat is still very, very rampant. All right, Pierre, we thank you for that. I want to go to London now, and James Longman has been following the developments about that plane crash that happened in Tehran just around the time that those missiles were being launched while the conflict was escalating. James, my question to you is, we have some new reporting now because now people are starting to question some of the statements that the Iranians have put out about exactly why that Ukrainian International Airlines flight went down, killing more than 170 on board.
Yeah, Tom, that's right. I think there are a lot of questions now, chiefly from people in Ukraine who are saying that the Iranians seemed to have an answer for this quite soon. They said that this was an engine failure. It was down to a technical fault before even any investigation had got up and running. So I think that's led to a lot of kind of claim and counterclaim. I think it's telling that the president didn't address this situation in those remarks just a little earlier, because really the situation is very, very unclear. It is obviously extraordinary that this plane was taken down during the last 24 hours, whilst this, whilst these tensions have been ramping up in the region. Let's just recap it. It came down to the sky just after 6 o'clock this morning in Tehran. It's a Ukraine International Airlines flight going from Tehran to Kiev in Ukraine. 176 people on board, all dead. The majority of those Iranians. We understand 63 Canadians on the manifest, but there were a lot of dual citizens. So we know that there are at least 3 Brits on board, Swedes and others. And so now big questions about, as you say, exactly how this could have happened, and suggestions perhaps that this plane was shot out of the sky. Now, no one has got any proof of that, but it does seem strange that this would happen just 3.5 hours after those missiles were launched on US bases in Iraq. And normally the procedure for what happens when a plane goes down is the country in which the accident or the incident happens, they lead the investigation. In this case, that's Iran. The country who owns the airline, in this case, that's Ukraine, would take part in the investigation. And the country where the plane is manufactured, in this case, that is the United States. And Boeing also takes part in the investigation. And you've got to ask, how is it that US investigators are going to be able to get there on the ground to find out exactly what has happened? That might be very, very hard indeed, particularly when we now know that the Iranians are refusing to hand over the black box. That's the machine that records everything that's happened in the cockpit and the kind of flight routes, and they're also refusing to hand it over to the Ukrainians, not just the US, because the Ukraine, of course, an ally of the United States. So a lot of questions as to just what happened. I think this is going to roll on and on and on, and a very difficult place for any real investigation, an open and transparent investigation, to take place. Tom?
Yeah, difficult place and also a difficult time for all those families of those victims. More than 170 of them spread out all across the globe. All right, James, we appreciate your reporting. To dig a little deeper on the investigation, I want to bring in senior transportation correspondent David Curley. He covers aviation for us. David, your initial assessment of what's happened so far. I know there's a lot of moving parts, and the timing of this couldn't be more difficult for both the Iranians and the Ukrainians to get a real answer.
And because there's a great fear that we may not get an open investigation because of the tensions between the Iranians and the U.S. What we do know, it appears, from flight data tracking information, is that there was some kind of catastrophic failure because this aircraft basically stopped sending data that would have shown where it was and what it was doing at the time. Catastrophic failure could be any number of things. One could be a catastrophic engine failure that ripped into the fuselage and cut the data that was being sent out to satellites and to the black boxes. Another is a bomb on board, which would have done the same, or a missile that hits it and actually blows the aircraft into pieces and stops the data being transmitted. So it seems like there's some kind of catastrophic failure. Now, there are signs that we will find on the wreckage. In the MH17 shoot down over Ukraine by those Russian supporters, we found that there was actually shrapnel in some of the fuselage that was found on the ground. Will we find similar signs? Some photos do suggest that there is shrapnel markings on some of the fuselage. It's difficult to see if you're just looking at a photo. It's not definitive at this point. And then there's a question of whether the Iranians will actually tell us. So far, they've said all these reports of a possible missile shoot down. And we're not talking about the missiles that were fired at the American bases in Iraq. We're talking about anti-aircraft missiles. It's a separate system that might have been used, and somebody may have pushed the button that sent these potentially a missile to take down an object that was flying around Tehran. What we may find is that the intelligence community of the United States was tracking radar data because those missiles that are fired, anti-aircraft missiles, are guided by radar. So there is a way to scoop up that data. So even if the Iranians do not give us the black boxes, do not hold an open investigation, do not bring in other parties that could tell us what could happen, there is a chance down the road that the truth will be known just from other data that has been scooped up by the intelligence committee. What is really shocking and striking about this is that more than a third of those passengers on board were from Canada. Many of them students or those that are dual nationalities, as James pointed out, who may have been going home to Canada. And that route to Kiev and then to Toronto is a route that a number of them take. 63 of them lost in this crash.
David, if you can break down some of that reporting you just mentioned, the missiles that possibly, if this theory that it was shot down out of the sky, they weren't the actual missiles that were being launched at Iraq, but they were anti-aircraft missiles possibly. Can you explain that a little more?
that would be most likely scenario, because the ballistic missiles that were fired at the Iraqi bases that the Americans are in are completely different. That's not a missile that you would use to bring down an aircraft. But Tehran is ringed by anti-aircraft systems, worried about missiles or aircraft coming in that would do damage to Tehran. And an anti-aircraft system would be a much smaller missile guided by radar, aimed at something that they see flying. Now remember, this aircraft had only just taken off. It had been in the air for less than 2 minutes. It was a little over 7,000 feet in the air, and that's where the anti-aircraft systems prowl, looking for anything that is incoming to vulnerable targets. And that's why anti-aircraft systems are used by countries like this. Really too early to tell. But the fact that the Iranians are pushing back on that line and not allowing the black box to be looked at openly, which usually these investigations, the whole reason for investigations of crashes like this is so that the international aviation community can make sure that we don't have problems in the future. We don't have a repeat of whatever happened. In this narrative of the last several hours, you heard, first there was, it was an engine fire, and then they're backing off of that. The Ukrainians backing off that as well, saying that this was a fine aircraft. It was only 3+ years old. It had been in maintenance just 2 days before this incident. So a lot of questions, and the Iranians really need to prove to the international community that they're going to provide some transparency into what happened to this aircraft.
David, can you talk to us briefly about the jet, what we know about the Boeing plane, and then also Ukrainian International Airways? I ask because I've flown Ukrainian International Airways a few times, and every time you land in Kiev and you tell people in Ukraine you've flown their airline, they're curious to know what your experience was like, because it doesn't have the stellar reputation of a luxury liner as other countries may have.
No, and it always is a question of the equipment and the training of the pilots. The Ukraine Airlines and the officials from the Ukraine are saying that this is one of their best aircraft, and they are saying the crew was one of their best crews that was on board this, and it could not be pilot error, is the latest statement we're having from them. This is a 737 Next Gen, the NG, not the MAX. The MAX remains grounded. This is an aircraft that has a very good record of safety. Now, you may remember the Southwest aircraft problem we had with Tammy Jo as piloting the aircraft, in which they had an uncontained engine failure, or an engine failure that actually blew a piece of the fan blade into the fuselage and decompressed that aircraft and caused significant issues and one death, the first death we've had in the U.S. in a decade. And she was able, with her co-pilot, to get that aircraft down into Philadelphia. But that tells you the resilience of the aircraft, even when it has a catastrophic failure like that. We don't know exactly, too many questions here. And questions of whether the Iranians will allow other parties that they don't have trouble with, like the U.S., to come in and investigate. And there are good investigators around the world. The Dutch did the MH17 shoot-down investigation and provided an excellent report. The Australians are very good. The Brits are very good. It's a question of who the Iranians may allow to come in and assist in this investigation.
Okay, David Curley, we appreciate your reporting. If you're watching ABC News Live, we have been following the breaking news, the crisis with Iran. The president speaking at the White House moments ago. Here's part of what he said.
Iran appears to be standing down, which is a good thing for all parties concerned and a very good thing for the world. No American or Iraqi lives were lost because of the precautions taken, the dispersal of forces, and an early warning system that worked very well. I salute the incredible skill and courage of America's men and women in uniform. For far too long, all the way back to 1979 to be exact, nations have tolerated Iran's destructive and destabilizing behavior in the Middle East and beyond. Those days are over.
All right, that was the president from the White House. I want to bring in our senior Washington reporter, Devin Dwyer. He's live in our Washington bureau this afternoon. And Devin, it sounds like both sides, both Iran and the U.S., are standing down for now. Your take on the president's comments earlier today?
Yeah, Tom, a real sigh of relief in this town, at least, and on Capitol Hill as well, in light of the president's speech. I got to tell you, though, the first line from the president today caught a lot of attention before he even said good morning. He said Iran will not be allowed to get a nuclear weapon. And, of course, one of the big questions now is whether Iran is poised to make a run at one. Just days before this clash really escalated, they announced that they were going to withdraw from some of the terms of the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. And the president today talked about his decision to trash that deal in 2018. And so the big question is whether both sides can reach some sort of a new deal. And I got to tell you, I was struck that the president today left the door open to some sort of negotiation here with Iran. It's unclear, and I must say unlikely, that that would happen before the election. But when you look at how Iran has responded to the president's moves on the Iran nuclear deal, you see that they, too, are keeping the door open to some sort of an agreement here. They have taken steps away from the deal, but they have not moved out of it completely just yet, although that breakout period is getting just a little bit narrower for them to have the material for a bomb.
Devin, you've been traveling the country also talking to voters about the 2020 election. I'm interested, what do you think, how do you think this affects the president and the Democrats running for president going forward?
Well, it's a good opportunity for any president incumbent to cast himself as a wartime president without a full-fledged war, and that's what Donald Trump has done today. You saw him surrounded by his generals. He loves that image. I would not be surprised if that appeared in a campaign ad. And of course, he loves a chance to take a swipe at his predecessor. You may have missed it, but in that speech, he also mentioned that those missiles which Iran fired at the U.S. bases overnight, in his words, were made possible because of the Iran nuclear deal that Barack Obama brokered. He said those missiles were paid for by funds released in that deal. Now, there's no evidence of that. But you see here that the president is very much making a political play. And I got to tell you, Tom, there are some risks involved in that. I spoke with a number of voters in Iowa yesterday, swing voters, about their response to this killing of Soleimani and how they feel about President Trump's handling of relations with Iran. They thought he did a pretty good job, the Democrats' criticism notwithstanding. So he is getting some positive reviews out in the middle of the country there. Of course, Americans, though, are very war-weary. And so if this escalates further, there could be some perils.
All right, Devin Dwyer for us. I want to bring in now an Iran expert to dig a little deeper on what's going on inside that country right now. Trita Parsi is a professor at Georgetown University's Center for Security Studies. He's live in our Washington bureau this morning. And Trita, thank you for joining us. Your take on what we heard from the president just moments ago, that Iran appears to be scaling back. It also appears the U.S. is scaling back as well.
That's the point. You know, both countries are essentially standing down, but the problem is that the conflict actually continues. So the type of a lower scale confrontation and agitation between the two sides will continue. It's just that they walked back from the brink of allowing it to escalate into a completely open, full-scale war. But the danger to go back to this point is still there unless there actually is some real de-escalation, meaning some form of diplomacy, perhaps mediation. And we heard nothing from Trump in that speech that he's signaling any openness to that.
There had been conflict ramping up over the past 6 months. What do you think, how do you think the leadership in Iran took the killing of Soleimani? That took them completely by surprise. But what do you think that did as far as how they wanted to react and what they thought that the president would make a move like that?
I think they were surprised by that move. They were also surprised by the previous rocket attacks by the United States against that militia. They saw that as being disproportionate to what had happened before. But what I think they're doing right now is that they, first of all, are consolidating their position internally, because what Trump has done through the assassination of Soleimani is that he's really unified Iran. The number of people we saw out on the streets for the funeral were simply unprecedented. And this is a regime that otherwise is very unpopular. So they're enjoying this moment and they're trying to consolidate their position. That's step number one. Step number two, I think, is that you will likely see other actors in the region doing other things against U.S. forces or assets, which the Iranians now probably will be able to say that they have plausible deniability for, because they did their thing and they said that this is the end of it, and then they will kind of wash their hands and say that they have nothing to do with whatever happens by Iraqi militias. Whether the U.S. will read it that way or not, of course, is a different story. But the idea that this has ended, I think, is a false and a rather dangerous one. This will not end unless there is some real de-escalation through diplomacy.
Yeah, the killing of Soleimani came at a particular time because, as you mentioned, the regime there in Iran was not popular. We had been seeing growing protests, in part because of what had happened with the sanctions from the United States government. I'm curious, you know, we just heard Devin Dwyer say how the president sort of opened the door to negotiations with Iran moving forward. Do you see any room for negotiations with the Iranian government? Is that something you think they would even entertain? Obviously not right now, but down the line?
Trump has signaled openness for negotiations in the past as well. The problem is that every time he does it, he also makes it more difficult. So, for instance, when President Macron of France was trying to get something for the Iranians and the Trump administration to agree on, and a smaller deal that would just reduce tensions, the challenge was that Trump wanted to have a photo op, and he wanted to have it before there was any deal. And that's just not the way diplomacy works. And it's certainly not the way the Iranians would agree to it, because it's actually very politically costly for them to have a photo op with Trump. And that was prior to Trump killing Soleimani. After killing Soleimani, I really see the likelihood of any photo op being less than zero. Will Trump nevertheless agree to diplomacy if he doesn't have like a press conference or a photo op that he can brag about? That remains to be seen.
All right, Trita Parsi reporting, giving us his analysis from our Washington Bureau. Trita, we appreciate that, and we appreciate your time. We thank you for watching ABC News Live. We have been rolling in our coverage right here of the Iran crisis. We'll continue with some of the highlights from the day right here on ABC News Live.